Good afternoon, and welcome to our last session, Future Forward Building Democracy That Delivers. I am happy to have you here. My name is Mitra Krasniqi. I am a program director with Policy and Program Learning here at SIPE. As we've seen over the course of the day, today we've talked a lot about threats to democracy, what the democracy delivers, and what is being done to continue to advance principles and free enterprise for democracy. What do we see and the future opportunities we should look forward to? The trends that show that democracy remains as the most viable form of governance that delivers for most people. So now we turn our attention to the future. This session will explore the evolving landscape of international development and the opportunities from collective action that lie ahead of us. With the world facing unprecedented challenges from rising authoritarianism to global economic uncertainties, how can we advocate for change and make the case for progress and for democracy? We have a fantastic panel with us here. So let me introduce our first panelist, Dr. Joseph Siegel, who leads the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Research and Strategic Communication Program, with the aim of generating policy-relevant analysis addressing Africa's security challenges. His research includes understanding the role of governance in advancing security and development, the role of external actors, including Russia, in Africa, and so on. Stabilizing fragile states, democratic transition, and strengthening institutions for democratic accountability. Dr. Siegel has written widely for leading policy journals and newspapers in regular media, and is a regular media analyst. Prior to joining the Africa Center, he was a Douglas Dillon Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior research scholar at the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies, and a senior advisor for democratic governance at DAI. For more than a decade, he served in various fields, capacities throughout Africa, as well as in Asia and the Balkans, with the international NGO World Vision and a Peace Corps volunteer. Dr. Siegel holds a doctorate in international security and economic policy from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and a master's degree in agricultural economics with an emphasis on African food security from Michigan State University. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you.
We also have our very own here from SIPE, Eric Hans, who leads SIPE's Center for Accountable Investment, which uses a lens of corrosive and constructive capital to examine the impact of investment on democratic and market institutions. The CI's work sits at the confluence of corporate governance, the rule of law, and the business and investment climate, with patterns of trade and investment worldwide. Eric is active in developing the capacity of business organizations to advocate on behalf of member interests and helping these organizations to foster a culture of inclusive business growth. Inclusive business growth. In prior roles, Eric was an associate at a law firm and a vice president at an investment bank, where he reviewed complex alternative investment products. He's frequently featured in media as an expert on economic reform and policy in Ukraine and other former Soviet states. Eric holds a bachelor's degree in Russian and political science from the University of Montana, a JD and an MBA from the University of Maryland, and he's a licensed to practice law in the state of Maryland. So welcome, Eric. So let me start with our first question. We also that we talked about different kinds of challenges, as I mentioned at the beginning, but looking forward, is renewing democracy that delivers really more a matter of rebuilding and reinventing these democratic processes and the underlying conditions of the free enterprise? Or is it more important or more timely for us to defend the norms and rebuild the civic organizations and institutions that we can focus? I'm not suggesting that either one should be, but we are at a crossroads. The theme of this gathering is that we are at a crossroads. So which one, how do we prioritize moving forward? Do we focus on fundamental processes, or do we keep making the case defending the norms that we already have? So let me start with you, Joe, first.
Well, thank you again, Michael, for being invited to the panel and to the discussion today. The argument that democracy has not delivered has been a key talking point of authoritarian narratives in the attempt to undermine support for democracy around the world. And, this has created some disillusionment. But it's important to remember that, in fact, there is a long evidence-based story showing that democracy has actually done a better job at generating sustained economic growth and at enhancing social development indicators in all regions of the world. Democracies are also linked with better upholding the rule of law, property rights protections, contract enforcement. And so this is one of the reasons that foreign direct investment, which is governance neutral, a priority, has in fact flowed at higher levels to countries with stronger democratic institutions. And the broader point here is that the rule of law doesn't happen in isolation, but it tends to be part of a broader pattern of upholding institutional checks and balances that are associated with democracy. So in answering the question, when we talk about renewing democracy, really it's about strengthening, apolitical, merit-based institutions that represent the web, the dense web of political institutions that create checks and balances that we see in democracies. That's the real secret sauce that helps democracies be more effective. And this is what sustains democracies between elections. And so we're talking about things like a free press that promotes transparency, a Ministry of Justice and justice system that ensures that all citizens' rights, regardless of political party, are protected, regardless of who's in power, an independent central bank, a merit-based civil service that respects and upholds different norms around taxes, property rights protections, getting access to credit, even things like making sure that the security sector, police and army, are apolitical and aren't being used as a political tool against political opponents. So I think my bottom line would be that not only are these hardcore democratic institutions vital for creating a level playing field for businesses and free enterprise and a more robust democracy, they're also critical for creating the resilient fabric that can resist authoritarian influences both domestically and internationally.
That's fascinating. Just a quick follow-up, Joe, on that. So it sounds to me that there are all these fundamental institutions that we need to make the case, and we need to strengthen them to foster. You mentioned some of them, the free press, the independent justice system. Do you see any other fundamental processes that need sort of like revisiting or reinventing or rethinking beyond the current arrangements that we need to think about in order to build either a broken link or just reinvent it?
I think the big change that I would point to is that in an increasingly globalized information space, you're seeing more foreign interference in democratic processes. And so this is polarizing debates. It's pushing out disinformation. And it is compromising the independence of individual political candidates who might benefit from some of that foreign disinformation. And so I think I had mentioned the importance of a free press, but I think, in terms of revitalizing or strengthening democratic processes, one of the things we really need to look at is how to help create healthier information ecosystems. And while protecting freedom of expression and freedom of speech, how do we filter out intentionally false, malign information that's purely intended to destabilize democracies?
Great. Thank you so much. Eric, you've been at the center of a lot of this activity over the however many years now. So I'm interested on your take on the same question that we just explored with Joe.
Sure, I generally agree with Joe, and that there's really no question that democracy delivers the goods. Look at any league table in terms of GDP, in terms of broad-based prosperity, depth of capital markets, intergenerational wealth transfer. All of these are democracies. There are a few exceptions, or people might quibble on the edges. Some states, that are blessed with resources, that have managed those resources well, that had small populations to begin with. Other city-states that have had a gentle hand, but a rather kind of unified state in an approach. But those are the marginal cases. By and large, if you want to create a society that delivers long-term sustainable growth and prosperity from one generation to the next, you need both a democracy and you need free market capitalism, and to embrace those two and their contradictions between those two, and the constant struggle between the markets and democracy. I do think that we're faced now the question, Mikra, that you had posited about this kind of changing situation. It is that I think that perhaps, and maybe this is a bit provocative, we've moved too far too fast with many international institutions, international agreements. You cannot have, to my mind, large authoritarian mercantilist states in the same house as free market based democracies, and do quote unquote free trade with these organizations. These two things are not compatible. Dave Copeland down at University of Virginia has recently written a great book on a kind of realist take with a slight slant towards the role of commerce, a book called A World Safe for Commerce. And as he reviews the kind of battle between colonial United States and imperial Britain and the American Revolutionary War, one of the undertones of that is a battle between free market capitalism, American business, American colonists that wanted to move up the value chain, and a mercantilist system that existed in England that wanted to keep and capture all of the finished product and higher end value of manufacturing. Now, again, this is not completely analogous to the current situation between authoritarian states and the United States in the world, but I do think that there are lessons that we can draw from that prior battle and from those prior conflicts. I do fear that sometimes with some of the top-down approaches that are being taken by many democratic states today, that we're perhaps learning some of the wrong lessons and trying to manage markets a bit too much. Securitizing perhaps too much, and undervaluing the competitiveness or the introduction of competitiveness into markets in conjunction with democratic actors. And then the last thing that I'll mention is about kind of rebuilding or embrace of institution. Look, it's an old saw, in kind of the business world, that in a family business, the first generation founds it, the second generation builds it, and the third generation destroys it in terms of the company. And so if we look at our international institutions today, When were they founded? They were founded post World War II. It's been 3 full generations since there's been any, and we can argue this point, Joe and Mika, and we all can argue this point, that there's really been, to my mind, no wholesale reimagination or reinstitutionalization of these post-war institutions that reflect today's reality. And so these organizations are somewhat frozen in amber, and are not necessarily fit for purpose for today's world, for a world in which commerce flows quite freely across borders. We're a world where dollars and euro dollars can be transacted quite easily at the click of a button. A lot of it has sped forward so fast that these institutions, really without substantial reform, can't keep up. And so then that begs the question: is what do you do? Do you engage in reform, or do you discard them? Do you create new institutions? I'd like to remind people that the League of Nations existed until 1946. And so great for the League of Nations, and I'm sure that people participated throughout the war. But at the end of the day, this was an institution that just kind of existed in this zombified amber state, and didn't reflect the world as it had changed. And perhaps that's where we are with many of our international institutions, and perhaps some of our own in the West, call it our domestic institutions, that have not kept up a pace with the change and the pace of change.
I could not agree with you that many of these international institutions that came out of the World War II really are outdated and need fundamental reform. But there are people out there who argue that, you have to deal with the world you have, not the one you wish you have, So in this case, you have major authoritarian countries out there that you need to sort of like work out practicable solutions on international level, whether it's trade, security, and other issues, rather than imagine that you could completely restructure. I don't know, maybe you're referring to World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, and so on and so forth. So how would you sort of like, it's a realpolitik, as they say, kind of situation, dealing with China, dealing with Russia, dealing with other sort of like rising countries that are not necessarily really friendly to a democratic system. How does one sort of like navigate this fundamental need for fundamental reform, at the same time working with a country like China and Russia and whatnot?
I would push back and say, can you work? In which areas can you work with
Right.
states that are committed to a 19th century worldview, with a worldview that might makes right, that we can redraw international borders through the force of arms, that we can deploy domestic slave labor and have no consequences, that we can deploy mercantilist practices without consequence. And that is the world that authoritarian powers envision. The quote, new world order, and the eternal friendship between Russia and China that Xi and Putin have signed up for. That is the world that these authoritarian powers want. I think that perhaps many democratic states are being hopelessly naive in the hopes that somehow these states will change their mind. But without substantive reforms within China, Russia, and other authoritarian states that acquiesce to this idea of free markets, of delineation between private property, private initiative, and state interests, and a state that embraces, imperfect as it is, some idea of human rights, some idea of the rule of law and due process for its own citizens. I really don't think that is a conversation that you can have at substantive depth between, say, the European Union and China or Russia. We can have the dialogue at the top level between leaders on specific issues. But as you get down into, particularly, if we're talking about the Center for National Private Enterprise here, business partners, right? Those are decisions that really can be manipulated, can be used to undermine democratic and market institutions in democracies, right? There are no qualms with the Chinese Communist Party or the Russian state of using Gazprom, of using a domestic market of 1.4 billion people, and weaponizing that against democracies. So there are not really many rules here. I know that my friends in the European Union and the European Commission, have studied these tariffs against Chinese vehicles, the EV vehicles, very hard. And it is tough to compromise with 27 independent states, but they had a scientific method. They assigned a specific tariff rate against each individual company based upon subsidies that they had, discovered. And what was the result of that? After months and months of deliberation, the Chinese slap tariffs on French cognac for dumping, ostensibly. So we have one system, in this case the EU, that's trying to comply with the rules, that is trying to go through that due process, and another system that just completely goes out of bounds and looks to hurt political actors where they are.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. And speaking of, Joe, of how, other states like China think of narratives, I wanted to turn this second question to the idea of competing narratives between authoritarian states and the type of vision they have versus democracies. And I want to quote you on the report that you wrote for NED, titled Winning the Battle of Ideas, Exposing Global Authoritarian Narratives and Revitalizing Democratic Principles. And at one point, this is what you say about democracies, like maybe taking for granted some of the successes and some of the sort of we become complicit, if you will, in some of our democratic processes. And here's what you write. Democracies have often been reticent to assert the value of their own governance system, leaving authoritarian powers to fill the resulting vacuum. Democracies cannot assume that the superiority of the participatory models of governance is self-evident. In order to retake the initiative, democracies need to play the winning hand they have and articulate a positive vision of democratic principles and international relations. I thought that was a striking quote for me, and I'd like if you can just expand a little bit on that complicity, democracies, and what can be done to sort of push that, play the winning hand we have, and make the case for why the system is actually the best we have.
Oh, well, thank you, Mikra. And I do think it speaks to the point of our discussion today. Most people in the world want to live in a democracy. That has been shown time and again in polls and by actions of people protesting and putting their lives on the line for more freedoms in their respective countries. Yet we have this paradox of declining levels of freedom and democracy in recent years for a host of reasons. But one aspect of this is that we've seen a concerted strategy on the part of global authoritarians, namely Russia and China, but also supported by others, to denigrate the viability of democracy, especially for countries in transition. And so it is important for democracy's proponents to not take it for granted that everybody understands the benefits of democracy, especially among youthful populations who may not have experienced the periods of dictatorial rule and under the Cold War, different types of authoritarian systems. And so as part of this battle of narratives, democracy advocates need to talk about the vision of what a democratically governed international rules-based order looks like, and how that has many advantages for people around the world. And this is beyond the obvious, civil liberties and political rights, which are obviously extremely important. But to remind audiences that democracies experience more stability. There are fewer financial crises in democracies. Democracies are much less prone to have conflict. As we mentioned, democracies have a better track record of generating per capita economic growth at all income levels, developing countries up to the most wealthy. And this translates also into higher levels of social development. So there's more equity in that growth. Democracies create a more hospitable business environment. So there's more opportunities to start and manage a business without having necessarily to have political connections. The lack of, or the less, the lower levels of political interference, along with greater stability and upholding the rule of law, all these things create a more attractive space for investment, both domestically and internationally. And so it opens up the door for more international capital and technology transfer, which dramatically improves the potential trajectories for economic development in a country. One of the narratives, one of the key authoritarian narratives is to highlight corruption in democracies. But in fact, this is one of democracy's strengths. When you look at all countries in the world, the median rate, medium ranking on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, the median ranking for democracies out of a pool of 180 countries is a 42. The median ranking for autocracies is 141. So there's a 100-place differential there in the median rankings and perceptions of corruption, depending on the governance system that you have. Globally, democracies also have a superior ability to collaborate and to find common ground in addressing transnational challenges. So this is especially critical today, as so many of the challenges we face are transnational in nature, are going to require some collective action. And this is going to be most likely in a place where you have some transparency and trust and commitment to upholding the public good. So, to be sure, democracies face many challenges, and especially democracies in poorer countries, places don't have a democratic tradition. And this democratic narrative I'm talking about, we need to acknowledge that. Yet it isn't just that they have problems, it's what do you do about them? And this is one of the real values and overlooked values of democracies, is they have these inbuilt mechanisms for self-correction. There are means by which grievances can be expressed and heard and acted upon. These same tools don't exist in autocracies. Citizens don't have recourse when things are going in the wrong direction, and it allows these leaders to continue to act with impunity. So, in short, democracy advocates need to remind citizens that in foregoing political rights and civil liberties, they not only lose democracy, but they are also going to be less well off economically.
Thank you, Joe. Maybe it's a good time now to launch that poll and see what some of our viewers think about the conversation. Eric, so Joe just went through a lot on how to make the case within the context of these competing narratives. But there are people out there, I'm sure you've encountered all the time, or do encounter still, who say like, what about inequality? You know, the rising inequality. You know, we've had democracy for the last 3 decades and there's been a rising inequality. How does democracy actually address one of its most serious drawbacks? And in a previous conversation that here we have a PPL and a Harvard Business School professor who wrote a long paper on economic dignity, how certain people perceive that, you know, the elites associated with some of the sort of international institutions have let people down, certain segments of society down. Case in point is France. France usually offers, you know, after tax income offers sort of like different kinds of schemes whereby it tries to sort of like deals with income inequality. And yet France has been one of the centers of sort of like this revolt against capitalism, or just in general against globalization in the last 10 years. So in other words, how do we talk about, you know, democracy and make the case, as Joe suggests, by really addressing also some of its issues, serious issues that we've been dealing with in the last 10, 15 years or so?
Yeah, and to echo Joe a bit here, I mean, there are relief valves in democracies. There are ways to change your position. You know, for all the talk of inequality, I would look at intergenerational mobility in democracies versus inequality. I mean, there are unequal outcomes. You know, and communism is probably the only system in which we can all guarantee that we'll equally be in poverty. I do think it's fascinating also that autocratic states, you know, find the necessity to clothe themselves in the verbiage and the traditions of democracy. So we have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We've got the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We have a Chinese constitution that guarantees this people's democratic dictatorship. We have Russia going through election cycle after election cycle with, you know, still going to the polls. You have them, you know, in the lands that they've forcibly conquered, you know, doing a vote of an ability to kind of be a people's republic in these systems. And so, you know, if they're so strong, if autocracies are so strong, why do they feel the need to clothe themselves in the terminology of democracy? And you have Chinese, you know, officials and the Twitter warriors, the Twitter diplomats, saying that you know, actually China is more democratic because we're more responsive to our people than the United States or other democracies. I would just say that look at facts, look at measurable things. I don't think that there's a mass movement of individuals from impoverished backgrounds knocking down the doors to enter China or Russia or Iran. I do see a lot of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. I do see migrants at the border of the United States trying to enter this country. And so why are they doing that? They see the opportunity in a rule of law and a democracy to advance their own interests. They think that their progeny, their children, will have a better chance or a better quality of life than they did, just as every immigrant to the United States, to Canada, to many Western democracies has seen for the past several generations. And you know, despite what you might say about inequality or outcomes, put those outcomes against the alternative. To quote the financial press, Tina, there is no alternative. If you want wealth creation and intergenerational mobility, there's been studies that have come out that have shown that after Mao's great revolution, the Cultural Revolution, demoting all of the cultural elites back into the countryside, that now 2 generations on, those elites that were put into the countryside are now back into those positions of power within China's power structure. And so that begs the question then is which system offers more opportunity? I think it's fairly clear. I think it's been documented through studies. It's fairly clear that these systems that we've had, that embrace markets, that embrace a democracy, do offer these opportunities. And if you take the example, as you did with France, Nigra, they're trying to preserve. They're actually some of the most liberal people I would call the most conservative, right? They want to preserve things like the 35-hour week, preserve things like generous social payments in a world in which those perhaps don't make financial sense for the state. And there is a conflict there, and there is an ongoing dialogue, but there are methods to work those out. Autocracies appear stable, and they offer stability. If you travel around Russia prior to the election, you have Putin's picture plastered up there with the Russian word stability underneath. But autocracies are stable until they're not, and then it's very messy and very bloody afterwards. And so if you are just an average citizen, an average person that wants to make a living, wants to provide for their family, wants to have, give their child a little better opportunity than they had, in which system would you rather live? Is always my question or response to these criticisms. And I think it's fairly clear over the past 100 years which systems have offered those opportunities.
Thank you, Eric. So Joe, speaking of systems and looking forward, do you see what do you see some of the opportunities for new kind of leadership, that really makes the case for what we're talking about here? Does the leadership in our era, which is, technological change and high uncertainty and emerging technologies, does it have to look different? Does it have to appear like they are playing by new rules, or whether there's a core set of there's a set of core leadership values that needs to be in play always to make the case for democracy?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike. It's interesting when we talk about leaders in democracy, we have to recognize that, democracies by their very nature are about citizens. They're participatory systems. That's what distinguishes them. And so leadership very much is going to look different than what you have in non-democratic systems. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we talk about this. We talk about revitalizing, reforming democracy. It isn't just about the official political leaders who are heading up established political parties. Democracies, the strength of democracies has always been in the web of social, cultural, educational, economic institutions that have helped to shape the public space and contributed to participatory governance, that have enabled and encouraged self-initiative on the part of communities outside of government. All of these factors are what make democracies so vibrant and so resilient. And I think it's especially important to keep that in mind today, because we are in this globalized competition for governance norms, we are seeing a strategy of global authoritarians to co-opt particular political leaders and parties. And this means of elite capture is creating a real vulnerability for countries that don't have robust checks and balances, because once co-opted, those leaders, out of their own political interest to stay in power, are willing to subvert their citizen interest, so their national interest, at the expense of their own political or private interest. And so that is the area where we've really seen democratic deterioration, is this attempt to use democratic structures like parties to force these takeovers or to navigate these takeovers. And again, there's often a willingness on the part of the domestic party leaders to go along with this in their short-term self-interest. And so when we talk about other leaders, I would remind all of us that historically, civil society actors, journalists, scholars have had a critical role to play in making democracies effective, to holding leaders accountable, but holding up democratic norms within its institutions. And that's especially important today with this effort to subvert specific political parties. I would also highlight the importance of private sector alliances, business associations, chambers of commerce. This group of the democratic spectrum needs to speak up and speak out in defense of democratic norms and institutions. Private sector actors have a lot to lose if we see an erosion in the democratic-based, rules-based international order. And as Eric was describing, the alternative is a lot less attractive. It's a lot more transactional, might makes right. It's much more predatory, and there's much less recourse to push back, which is part of what we have created in the post-World War II set of international institutions. And so, private sector actors need to remember that, political monopoly almost inevitably translates into economic monopolies. And this is going to squeeze out genuine businesses and really drives things down to who is willing to be an acolyte to those in power. So, I would highlight the important voice that private sector actors have. They are seen as representing the middle class of a society, and they have a lot of respect and gravitas in terms of shaping public opinion. And so, strong support from private sector for the importance of holding democratic institutions is really critical. So in short, leadership is going to come from multiple places, as it always has. And that is the reality of popular government. It needs people to step up and to be heard and to represent those interests.
Thank you, Joe. So Eric, as Joe mentioned, it's a web. It's not really about one institution or one particular practice when it comes to leadership. I wonder what is your view on, but political leadership matters, of course, as we've seen everywhere. How does How do you build those alliances that Joe is referring to? Those, how do you mobilize the private sector, especially that there is an uneasiness about the private sector and corporations getting involved in politics? I don't know, since Milton Friedman, I think, told people that corporations have no business in politics. They need to be responsible to their shareholders. But then later that view was really weakened by the stakeholder capitalism idea. So I wonder what's your view on like that kind of leadership that encompasses this whole notion, a systemic notion of democracy and mobilizing private sector to look at it.
Yeah, I do think that there's a great call out for a collective leadership of the private sector. And this is really where we see institutions like chambers and associations come into their own. As Joe had noted, political monopoly leads to economic monopoly. It is in your business's long-term interest to have competition in governance and active participation of multiple parties, multiple persons, and policies that are competing on a number of different approaches to governance. It's interesting you brought up Friedman, right? And his quote is, "Your only responsibility is to your shareholders." But there's always a second clause that people miss when they quote that, and they give that Friedman quote within the bounds of I believe it's morality and the law. And don't quote me on that, but it is that direction. So he mentioned his morals and legality in the second clause of the sentence. So again, it's not about just doing anything as a business to benefit your shareholders. You have to act within the bounds of morality and legality. So I do think that even Friedman, recognized that there is a place for good governance and a separate entity which governs, right? So, and I think his cautionary tale here about business not being involved and business having no business in politics is one that recognizes that the political space, that the governance space should indeed be separate, within this realm. At CIPE, we always, and not only at CIPE, but World Bank and others, say that, the government is kind of the referees on the field, and the government sets the field, and then the competitors have a match in the field. I don't know if that's, I think it's a bit too simplistic. I think that perhaps we need to act in 3 dimensions. And so rather than a field, we imagine a sphere. And within the sphere, there are individuals and entities within that sphere, and they can come together or come apart at points in time. And a free society, a free market, a free process of democratic governance allows these entities to interact, to intermingle, to achieve their goals, which are at the perimeter of this sphere. And they may be in any direction, left, right, north, south, east, west. They are their own initiative. But the amalgamation of these individuals and entities within the sphere are themselves, free to interact. And the place in which they interact within this sphere is governed by the governance systems, the democratic processes, the good governance, the public governance systems that are put in place in these positions. Is that a perfect analogy? A perfect metaphor? I don't think so. I'll keep working on it. And I'll come back to you, Mikra. Maybe we'll write a paper.
No, that's great. No, I love
it. But I think it gets to some of the essence about what makes a dynamic society. And we have rapid technological progress here, right? And I'm sure that many people in the audience today and here have seen that kind of the hockey puck or hockey stick wealth generation, right? Where, up until about 200 years ago, if you were a shoemaker, you were destined to be a shoemaker and a son of a shoemaker and a daughter of a shoemaker for the rest of your existence. And, that's probably the most you can aspire to. So it's only in the past 200 years that all this stuff has come out. And then if you look closer in terms of leadership and politics, we have the emergence of the yellow press, emergence of the printing press, and wide distribution of literacy, and the impact of that. Then in the last 20 years, we have social media, where everyone's their own editor. And I think that democracies are still digesting that. And there is no no right response right now, because we're only 15 years, 20 years into that latest evolution. And as we progress down that path, which will it be? Will it be the dynamic societies that figure out the right policies to implement on social media, as they've done with the press and others? Or will it be authoritarian systems that simply ban things that they don't like? To my mind, if I were to be a betting man and put money on it, I would put my money on the more dynamic societies that will come up with finely attuned policy solutions through a period that looks a bit like chaos. And as we get through it, come out the other side with something that works and that's reflective of the needs and necessities of both markets and democracy.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. That's illuminating, really. Before I go to, we have some interesting poll results I'm going to read to you in a second. But I wanted to take a question, or actually a couple questions that are interesting. But one of them, I think, Joe, you and both of you actually almost addressed, which is the private sector role. But I see this as a mechanism for self-correction. So the phrase is used in the context of the question: can private sector help? Can it be used as a mechanism of in democracies for self-correction? I get that to mean with some of the issues we have. Again, you both talked about the private sector's vital role in this. Are there any other things you can think of, like how can private sector be a more direct in addressing some of the I don't know, like inequality, for example, or make the workplace or make the jobs or employment in a sense more equal, have equal access, more inclusive? What can they do separate from economic policy led by government? The private sector can take this initiative to sort of like bolster the case that in a democracy, as you both said, there are all these mechanisms that help you both debate and reinforce the idea that we can, even if we have problems, we can talk about them and hopefully we can solve some of them. So what can private sector do more directly as a mechanism of self-correction, to use that phrase? I'll start with you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Mikra. Well, I would think about this not just on the, the stereotypical economic issues on which the private sector is most interested, but that private sector has a role in upholding democratic norms and institutions. And so in a number of parts of the world, we're seeing extra constitutional seizures of power. And it's important for private sector actors to not endorse that. Because that ultimately it's bad for democracy, but it's going to be bad for business. You're losing all of the democratic infrastructure of property right protection, access to licenses, credit, and certifications that go along with that. And so that quickly leads to cronyism, political patronage, and squeeze out a vibrant private sector. Again, you're less free and less well off. So, that's a way that I see the private sector playing a critical role. Protecting judicial independence. We've seen in a number of countries, most recently in Tunisia, where a country enduring deterioration in democracy, the president effectively is just firing magistrates with whom he doesn't agree. that's something where private sector can lend their voice along with civil society, say, no, that isn't okay. That isn't the norm we want to uphold. And, we all benefit from a reliable rules-based order that creates protections for citizens against a overreaching leader. But it just also creates an environment where you have more space for private sector entrepreneurship, and also a healthier space for international investors to want to come in. So these are ways in which I see the private sector, again, usually operating collectively and speaking collectively to stand firm. And sometimes that's going to require restraint, because often the way this goes is leaders lacking legitimacy are going to try to cut deals with individual private sector actors to gain some sense of credibility and legitimacy. And those leaders may be tempted because they feel that will give them some protection, but they need to realize, you're eroding the very foundations, the institutional foundations that have allowed the private sector to thrive and create more opportunities to do so in the future. And so really, I think reinforcing within the private sector that, yeah, you have a role here. Even though you're the private sector, you have a role in upholding these public norms about how things are governed.
Thank you, Joe. Eric, this next question seemed to be more about one of your points you made earlier. So we have a couple minutes left, but let me just read the question. It says, Eric mentioned the incompatibility of non-democratic / market-oriented systems participating in big global organizations. But what about the hybrid governments like Hungary? They are EU members, but also implement things like the strategic partnership agreements. How do you navigate that nuanced challenge? So if you can just briefly address that, please.
Yeah, look, Hungary comes up quite a bit in work in Europe. And I would just point out that despite what, media narratives are, there are elections in Hungary, as slanted as they are. They still have to go through that process. To my earlier point about kind of having to go through these election cycles. So Hungary is might be termed a hybrid regime, but there's no permanence there, right? There at the next election, the prime minister might lose his mandate, and indeed, if polls indicate, well, he might. At the same time, you have external organizations like the EU and Madame von der Leyen this morning, I believe, chastising publicly the prime minister, Prime Minister Orban, in front of the EU. It remains to be seen. The prime minister has invited in many Chinese manufacturing operations, has essentially played footsie with Vladimir Putin under the EU table, and that's building up a lot of resentment within EU institutions and within neighboring countries. And so I would perhaps push back and say that there is no permanence here in democratic governance. As long as you have those elections, as long as you're going through these cycles, as long as there is an relatively open and free media, there are many different dynamic sources of pushback in the case of a hybrid regime like Hungary. And that perhaps, despite the hand-wringing and the newspaper article writing, which is necessary and which is part of the process, we should, if we take the longer point of view, be a little less worried and a little more confident in democratic processes, procedures, and the long-term will of citizens to see good governance in action.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric, so much. I promise to read you quickly the results of the poll before we go. So here are what some of our viewers think about opportunities for democracy. The question is, what are the best opportunities to strengthen democracy that delivers? 25% think economic reform, 50% think it's fighting corruption, 75% think is international support for democracy, Also 75% think democratic innovations for civic engagement. Also 75% is civic education making the case for democracy. And also 50% business leadership, multi-stakeholder partnerships. You know, that's really a great spread. I wish we could talk some more, but we're at time. I want to thank you both, Joe and Eric, for this really wonderful conversation. I learned a ton as always, and I hope everybody enjoyed this. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for to all our viewers. FEDN is a great forum for us and to talk about these issues. So I wish you all a good day, and thank you so much for coming.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mikra.
Bye-bye.